It's almost impossible not to smile when you think of Roy Clark. Picture him on a warmly lit stage, grinning ear to ear, guitar or banjo in hand, playfully introducing the next tune with a wink and a joke. That down-home charm of his came wrapped in a blazingly fast-picking style that dazzled both country fans and hardened rock guitarists. There's a moment, frozen in time, where he looks right into the camera, nods his head slightly, and then sets his fingers loose on the strings at lightning speed. His music had this uncanny way of being both virtuoso and fun, all in the same breath. People sometimes ask, how did one man manage to be a world-class instrumentalist, a star of one of the longest-running country variety shows, a comedic personality, and, by all accounts, a genuinely warm and charitable human being? Well, Roy Clark's story isn't just about the big smiles and high-speed licks. It's about a boy growing up in the shadow of the Great Depression era, forging his own path in an entertainment business that was changing by the minute, and finding ways to keep his feet planted in the old country tradition while pushing it into new, uncharted territory. He was born on April 15, 1933, in Meherrin, Virginia, a quiet corner of the American South. Times were tough. His family tree was rooted in a culture shaped by church gatherings, front porch picking, and those communal Saturday nights where musicians would come together to help neighbors escape the harsh realities of daily life. When Roy was just a kid, it wasn't unusual to see relatives and neighbors gather in a living room, battered guitars in hand, run-down fiddles squeaking out tunes that had been passed along through generations. Imagine a raggedy, worn carpet, a few mismatched chairs, and folks tapping their shoes against the wooden floor in perfect rhythm. It was in these small circles that Roy first experienced the galvanizing power of music. It brought people closer, offered some warmth against life's uncertainties, and turned an ordinary evening into an impromptu festival. The mid-20th century American entertainment scene was a lively crossroads of tradition and innovation. You had the radio dominating homes, carrying not only the news, but also the far-flung voices of the Grand Ole Opry. Meanwhile, the seeds of rock and roll were on the verge of blooming, and mainstream country music was edging closer to popular acceptance. By the time Roy was a teenager, the structures of touring circuits and the presence of small television stations were giving regional artists a boost to bigger stages. It's under this broad canvas of shifting entertainment frontiers that Roy Clark would come to leave his indelible mark, first as a young prodigy on various instruments, then as a comedic presence, and ultimately as an icon whose face seemed eternally etched into the cultural memory of the 1970s and beyond. Roy's earliest memories of music centered on his father, who was no slouch on the fiddle. The house was alive with sound at all hours. It wasn't unusual for Roy's father and his musical buddies to stay up late, trading licks until the sun thought about rising. Roy once recounted a story of being just 6 or 7, peeking around the corner when he was supposed to be in bed. He was mesmerized by the interplay of grown men, the way one would stomp a foot to keep time, while the other soared in a fiddle break that seemed to stop everyone's breath. And there was Roy's father, methodically teaching him chords, scales, and the sense of timing that's second nature to any great country or bluegrass player. You could say the DNA of Roy's style was being printed right there on those late-night jam sessions in a small Virginia home. A certain looseness, a sense of humor, and a deep respect for tradition. Not all was simple, though. Roy's family moved around, partly for work and partly to find their place in a shifting economy. Eventually, they ended up closer to Washington, D.C., where Roy spent his teenage years. In those days, Washington was a magnet for rising country acts. Small clubs offered hillbilly or barn dance segments, and the city's local television stations were eager for fresh talent. Here, a young Roy Clark had the world at his fingertips. He didn't just play the guitar, he wrestled it like it was a living thing, coaxing out machine gun runs or gentle melodic lines that could make your heart tighten. He also had a knack for the banjo, mandolin, fiddle, and just about anything with strings. Before long, word spread. There's this kid in D.C. who can play faster than you can imagine. He can also sing, crack jokes, and bring the house down all by himself. By the time Roy was 15, he had already won a couple of national banjo championships. It wasn't just technical skill. Even at that age, Roy had a way of connecting with people. He seemed to look at the crowd not as an abstract sea of onlookers, but as future friends he hadn't met yet. Among the local circuit, older musicians noticed that Roy's sense of humor was just as natural as his playing. On stage, he'd occasionally drop in a funny side comment or poke gentle fun at himself. Audiences loved it. Local television producers, always on the hunt for fresh energy, started booking him for small variety spots. Picture a teenage Roy Clark wearing a broad grin and a cowboy hat that practically dwarfed his face, standing in front of a single camera in a modest TV studio. The sets were often makeshift, maybe a painted barn backdrop or a plain cloth curtain. But from that simple stage, Roy began forging a reputation that would carry him to places far beyond the city limits. There's an interesting anecdote from this era that few people talk about, an instance that showcases Roy's early stage persona. He was about 17 when a seasoned country bandleader, Red Foley, came through town looking for local openers for a show. Roy got the gig, and during his set, he accidentally broke a banjo string mid-performance. The crowd tensed up, expecting a long, awkward pause, but Roy just shrugged, cracked a joke about how banjos can be temperamental divas, quickly found a backup instrument at the side of the stage, and launched into a comedic tune he'd only practiced a handful of times. The audience roared, not just at the humor, but at the sheer aplomb of a kid who could turn a mistake into a highlight. Red Foley was reportedly impressed by this young performer's adaptability. This little-known event would foreshadow Roy's entire career, unflappable, playful, and truly excited to entertain, no matter what came his way. As Roy got older, he considered a professional career in music, but there was another path tempting him: boxing. That's right. He once had a growing interest in stepping into the ring. Maybe it was the thrill, or perhaps he liked the discipline. Fortunately for music lovers everywhere, he chose the guitar over the gloves before long. Though Roy would joke in interviews that the bright lights of a boxing ring didn't compare to the fun he found on a stage, it's thought that his time training honed the sharp reflexes that later defined his lightning-fast playing. While many fans might be aware of his brilliance as a musician, only a handful know that there was an alternate universe where Roy Clark could have been known as a prizefighter. In his 20s, Roy began touring with various bands, driving up and down the East Coast, playing small venues, radio gigs, and eventually snagging more television appearances. By the late 1950s, he had caught the attention of established country figures who recognized his immense promise. One such figure was Jimmy Dean, who was then at the cusp of mainstream recognition with his own television show. Roy joined Jimmy Dean's band and soon found himself in the thick of show business, live audiences, sponsored demands, and the early complexities of television production. It was a world away from those living room jam sessions in Virginia, but Roy seemed to thrive on the hustle. Through Jimmy Dean's show, he was introduced to a national audience. Observers were awestruck by Roy's effortless transitions between comedic skits and virtuosic guitar segments. He could go from a silly one-liner to a heartbreakingly beautiful chord progression in the blink of an eye. One rarely mentioned memory from around that time comes from a small broadcast station staffer who recalled seeing Roy backstage, meticulously restringing his guitar. While many artists had roadies or assistants, Roy insisted on doing it himself. He took a moment to chat with the staffer, talking about how each new string was a chance to get a fresh start, a chance to discover a new nuance in his playing. Then, with a characteristic grin, Roy said something along the lines of, "And if I break one, well, that's just a fun story for the crowd." That laid-back approach would become legendary, and it spoke to Roy's philosophy. Mistakes aren't dead ends, they're stepping stones to a more vibrant performance. Things began to accelerate. Roy made guest appearances on other variety shows, each time broadening his audience. Then, in the early 1960s, he had a real breakthrough when he signed with Capitol Records. At this point in Nashville, the Nashville sound was booming, with lush orchestral arrangements creeping into country music. Yet Roy's first recordings found a middle ground, respecting the traditional acoustic elements while also smoothing the edges for a broader audience. His pick and style remained front and center, though, and that's exactly what fans clamored for. It wasn't just the intricacy, it was how joyous it sounded. His guitar seemed to giggle under his fingers at times, echoing the pure delight Roy felt in sharing the music. Despite his success in studio recordings, Roy never stopped craving the immediate feedback of a live crowd. He once said, "A TV camera goes right through your soul. If you're a phony, you can't hide it." He insisted that performing live in front of real people was the ultimate measure of a performer's authenticity. That belief shaped every gig he played, from the smallest clubs to the glitzy stages of large TV sets. Roy's authenticity was, in many ways, an anchor that kept him grounded. He never seemed swept away by fame or the demands of the industry. Instead, he wore his success like a comfortable old jacket, well fitted to his easygoing nature. As the 1960s progressed, Roy's reputation as a comedic musician brought him into circles well beyond country music. He was a frequent guest on The Tonight Show, where he'd banter with the host and wow the live band with his seemingly off-the-cuff ability to adapt to any musical style. One night he might rip through a boogie-woogie jam, then a few months later, he'd come back and add a country twang to a pop standard. Johnny Carson, who prided himself on comedic timing, once reportedly told Roy that he should consider hosting his own variety show. That seed would soon sprout into one of the most iconic programs in country television history, Hee Haw. Launched in 1969, Hee Haw was a country-themed variety show that combined corny, sometimes slapstick humor with top-tier musical performances. Roy Clark co-hosted alongside Buck Owens, another legend with his own distinctive style. At first glance, the show's hay bale sets, rural stereotypes, and pun-laden sketches might seem like a formula for cheap laughs. Critics did indeed slam it as unsophisticated, but for millions of viewers, Hee Haw felt like a comedic love letter to country life, and Roy Clark stood at the heart of it with that trademark grin. The synergy between him and Buck Owens was something special. They would trade comedic barbs, then pivot seamlessly into a brilliantly played duet. Roy's comedic sensibilities found their home in the show's silly skits. He'd pop up from a cornfield to deliver a one-liner, or appear in a cameo during a comedic meltdown by another cast member. But behind the laughter lay a powerful truth. The musical talent on Hee Haw was truly top-notch. Legends like Loretta Lynn, Johnny Cash, Dolly Parton, and Tammy Wynette all stopped by. Roy's presence guaranteed that these visiting artists would be treated like family. Backstage stories paint Roy as the ultimate welcoming figure. He'd greet big stars and up-and-coming acts alike with equal enthusiasm, offering them a chance to jam, share a drink, or simply trade stories. So many who appeared on Hee Haw talk about the atmosphere as being more like a friendly barn party than a studio production. That warmth radiated through the TV screens, explaining why the show consistently drew large audiences. One untold Hee Haw anecdote that surfaces occasionally among old staff is how Roy used to entertain the crew between takes. The cameras were off, sets were being rearranged, and Roy would pick up his guitar or banjo and start improvising comedic songs about the day's mishaps. Maybe the director's flubbed line or a stagehand who spilled coffee. The entire crew would erupt in laughter. The show's producers eventually encouraged him to incorporate that sense of spontaneity on the air, which is why viewers sometimes caught Roy looking off camera, laughing mid-phrase. He was continuing an inside joke with the people behind the scenes. That genuine camaraderie became the soul of Hee Haw. Still, not everyone was on board with the show's portrayal of rural life. Some critics argued that Hee Haw perpetuated stereotypes, reducing country folk to punchlines. There were concerns that mainstream audiences would come away with a caricature rather than a nuanced understanding of country culture. Roy, for his part, addressed these concerns with empathy. He explained that Hee Haw's humor came from a place of affection, from the tradition of tall tales, front porch jokes, and the comedic stylings of the Grand Ole Opry. He saw it as an exaggeration meant to invoke shared laughter, not to demean. And indeed, for many rural and suburban fans, the show felt like a celebration of a simpler, folksy perspective, an escape from the tumultuous late 1960s and 70s. After all, the country was grappling with political unrest, rapid social change, and generational divides. Hee Haw offered 60 minutes of respite with a toe-tapping beat and a friendly twang. In parallel to his TV success, Roy continued recording and touring. He had hits like Yesterday When I Was Young, a poignant tune that showcased his ability to deliver heartfelt vocals. Many fans remember watching him perform that song on television with a tear in his eye, the comedic mask momentarily set aside, revealing a man who understood life's fleeting nature. The emotional weight of that performance was a reminder that behind the banjo jokes and comedic sketches, Roy Clark was an artist deeply in tune with the joys and sorrows of the human condition. He also crossed musical boundaries in ways that were uncommon for country artists of his era. In the mid-1970s, he was part of a cultural exchange tour to the Soviet Union, one of the first major country acts to perform behind the Iron Curtain. These concerts were a revelation for both Roy and his new audiences. Imagining Roy in a grand Soviet concert hall, with an audience that may not have fully grasped the English lyrics or the comedic context, but who were absolutely spellbound by his dexterous fingers and the heartfelt intonation of his music, is remarkable. Reportedly, after a show in Moscow, a local musician approached Roy in halting English, thanking him for coming so far to play, and expressing how the notes spoke a universal language that transcended politics. Roy's eyes welled with tears as he recounted that story years later. He deeply believed music could bridge vast cultural divides. Throughout these adventures, Roy remained a family man. He married Barbara Joyce Rupard in 1957. Their relationship stood the test of time, which in the entertainment industry is no small feat. Offstage, Roy was known to be private, preferring a cozy home life over Hollywood parties. While he adored meeting fans and thrived in the spotlight, he'd often say that the best part of going on the road was coming back to the people he loved. There's a little-known anecdote involving Roy inviting a small group of fans, stranded after a concert due to a canceled bus, onto his tour bus to make sure they found a safe ride home. When they reached the station, Roy gave them autographed photos and spent nearly an hour just chatting, treating them not as intruders on his privacy, but as guests he was glad to help. Moments like that weren't part of any press strategy. They were simply expressions of who Roy Clark was at heart. In the 1980s, with Hee Haw's popularity still roaring, Roy became synonymous with mainstream country entertainment. He also started giving back to the community in more direct ways, supporting music education programs, especially those that provided instruments to underprivileged youth. Being an artist who came from humble means, Roy understood how a single guitar in the hands of a passionate child could change a life trajectory. He didn't publicize these philanthropic efforts much, but occasionally stories would leak about Roy donating instruments to rural schools or quietly funding scholarships for aspiring country pickers. He believed that music was not just a career path, it was a gift that could imbue a sense of purpose and belonging. Among his peers, Roy garnered respect for his willingness to be a mentor. Young country musicians, eager to break into the Nashville scene, might find themselves sharing a green room with Roy Clark, and before they knew it, he'd be giving them a quick lesson on chord voicings or offering them an impromptu jam session. A lesser-known story involves a now-established country star who recounts how, in the early 80s, Roy spent nearly an entire afternoon showing him advanced banjo techniques. At the end of it, Roy only asked for one thing: make sure you pass it on to someone else someday. That ethos of paying it forward underlined Roy's genuine love for the craft and the community. Despite his enormous popularity, Roy did have critics. Some traditionalists felt that his comedic style diluted the pure essence of country music. Others contended that by mixing comedic sketches with serious music, Roy risked trivializing the songs themselves. A few even argued that Hee Haw's broad comedic strokes overshadowed Roy's serious guitar prowess, preventing him from receiving the full recognition he deserved as a musician. While there's merit in debating how comedic packaging interacts with musical art forms, Roy seemed unbothered by such chatter. He remained steadfast in his belief that laughter and musical virtuosity weren't mutually exclusive, that in fact they could amplify one another. His unstoppable grin in the face of such critiques suggests he found it more productive to keep playing, keep joking, and let the audience decide for themselves. Hee Haw eventually ended its new episodes in the early 1990s, but by then it had cemented itself as a staple of American television culture. Reruns would continue to air for years, bringing Roy's laughter and music to younger generations who never saw the original broadcasts. Meanwhile, Roy's touring schedule eased up somewhat, but he never fully retired. Even when he wasn't on a major tour, he'd do guest spots at festivals, record new music, or appear in special TV segments celebrating country legends. The man simply couldn't put his guitar down for long. It was, in many ways, an extension of his personality. For Roy Clark, awards and honors flowed in over the years: multiple Grammy Awards, membership in the Grand Ole Opry, inductions into various halls of fame, and even the distinction of being one of the earliest country music artists to receive a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Yet he wore these accolades lightly. His interviews rarely dwelled on trophies or achievements. He seemed more focused on the next gig, the next opportunity to pick up an instrument and connect with an audience, whether that audience was a packed concert hall or a handful of friends in someone's living room. As we look back on his life, one angle that isn't highlighted enough is Roy Clark's role in forging connections across generational, cultural, and musical divides. While Hee Haw might have seemed archaic to younger viewers by the 1980s, a closer look reveals a platform that introduced countless fans to the sounds of legends like Johnny Cash and Loretta Lynn, as well as up-and-coming artists who'd later shape country music's future. Moreover, Roy's collaborative spirit, especially his willingness to mix it up with jazz, pop, or rock players, paved the way for modern country's cross-genre fusions. His 1976 trip to the Soviet Union underscored that music transcends borders and politics, a sentiment that resonates as powerfully today as it did then. Perhaps the most moving testimonies about Roy come from everyday folks who had fleeting interactions with him, people who approached him after a gig, or even just encountered him in a diner. These stories invariably describe a friendly, open-hearted man who was genuinely interested in hearing about your life as much as sharing stories from his own. He wasn't the type to brush off a stranger. He maintained that sense of humility, remembering what it felt like to be a wide-eyed kid in small-town Virginia, enthralled by the magic of music. One of the seldom discussed personal challenges Roy faced was the pressure of balancing an almost relentless career pace with the emotional demands of family life. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, and simple day-to-day moments because of touring and filming commitments. Later in life, he confessed that if there was a regret, it was not always being there for his loved ones during important milestones. Yet those who knew him best say he tried to make up for it with the quality of time, if not the quantity, lavishing attention on his children and grandchildren when he was off the road, teaching them songs, or just enjoying quiet family dinners. His children noted that while they might have missed him on a random Tuesday, when he did come home, he was fully present. No diva airs, no special demands, just dad sitting at the table telling stories and sometimes pulling out his guitar for a private concert. As decades rolled on, Roy adapted to changes in the music business. He embraced new recording techniques and stayed active in television specials, even as the classic variety show format gave way to more reality-driven programming. While the industry's evolution left some older performers feeling out of place, Roy appeared to maintain a sense of curiosity. He'd comment with a chuckle that technology was making it easier for people to learn how to play instruments, but that the crucial ingredient, practice, remained something no gadget could substitute. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Roy's health began to show signs of strain. Traveling became more challenging, and while he'd still show up to important events or special concert appearances, fans noticed he wasn't quite as spry as before. Nevertheless, each time he stepped onto a stage, that twinkle in his eye returned, and his hands seemed to come alive on the fretboard. At a tribute concert in his honor, many of country's younger stars shared how they'd grown up watching him and learning from his style, both musically and in terms of showmanship. Some joked that his comedic timing taught them as much about pacing a performance as any formal training ever could. The event felt like a passing of the torch from a pioneer who paved the way for bridging comedic entertainment and serious musicianship to a new generation ready to carry that torch forward in their own creative ways. Roy's passing in November 2018 was met with an outpouring of affection and gratitude from fans and fellow musicians around the world. Social media lit up with tributes, and major news outlets paused to acknowledge his immense contribution. Yet for all the fame and recognition, the stories people shared were intimate and heartfelt, like he was a family friend who just happened to be on TV all the time. They spoke of his generosity, his sense of fun, his unstoppable love of picking a stringed instrument until the world felt a bit brighter. Even controversies tied to Roy seemed mild in the grand scheme. Some hold that Hee Haw's comedic shtick contributed to a narrow image of rural America, while others point out that it actually opened the door for countless country musicians to gain national exposure. The debate remains, but no one disputes Roy's place in country music's pantheon of beloved legends. Was he first and foremost a comedic performer or a virtuoso instrumentalist? The best answer might be that he was unabashedly both. His legacy stands as a testament that you can, in fact, blend high-level musicianship with humor and still remain deeply respectful of the tradition you come from. Why does Roy Clark matter today? In a world often divided along cultural and political lines, his life story offers a potent reminder that music and laughter can bring people together, transcending differences in background and belief. His refusal to take himself too seriously, even at the height of fame, exemplifies a kind of humility that modern celebrities could learn from, and his mastery of multiple instruments and love for teaching others demonstrates that artistry isn't something locked away for the chosen few. It's something that can be nurtured, developed, and shared generously. For those who grew up hearing his jokes and solos echo through the family television on Saturday nights, Roy Clark remains a comforting icon, someone who delivered laughter and harmony into living rooms across America and beyond. One of the striking things about Roy's story is that it doesn't culminate in a monumental scandal or a tragic downfall. Instead, it culminates in warmth, community, and the quiet ripple of legacy. Many grand narratives lean on dramatic controversies to keep us hooked, but Roy's life suggests another route: consistent kindness, extraordinary talent, and a commitment to making people feel good whenever possible. In the grand tapestry of American entertainment history, he's a thread of genuine good humor, bridging the gap between old-timey radio barn dances and modern televised variety. He embodied the notion that being a star doesn't have to mean distancing yourself from ordinary people and everyday joys. So here we are, reflecting on a man whose nimble fingers and broad grin once lit up the stage, from local clubs to primetime TV. If there's a single takeaway from Roy Clark's journey, it's that you can remain grounded even when your name is in lights by holding on to the simple things: family, community, and the profound magic of music. His life was about connecting instruments to hearts, connecting comedic sketches to universal laughter, and connecting generations of fans who found, in Roy Clark, a reason to love country music. He didn't walk in the shadow of bigger stars. He stood as a star entirely in his own right, fueled by a passion that was as authentic as it was infectious. Thank you for remembering Roy Clark, a man whose hands moved faster than our eyes could track, whose smile lit up thousands of stages, and whose generous spirit touched millions of lives. If his story tells us anything, it's that greatness and goodness are not mutually exclusive. In fact, in Roy's case, they were inseparable. So the next time you hear the lively twang of a banjo or find yourself chuckling at a comedic moment in a country tune, think of Roy Clark. His notes and laughter are still with us, quietly urging us to pick up a guitar, share a laugh, and never forget that the simplest joys in life are often the most profound.